tone, please state your name followed by the pound sign.
And welcome to
your line has been muted.
Webinar series. My name is Jasper Hobbs and I will be moderating today's session. Today's webinar is titled Building Consensus for Better Water Quality Outcomes and will be presented by Dr. Frank Dukes of the Institute of Environmental Negotiation at the University of Virginia. We'll get started in a few moments, and while we wait for everyone to finish logging on, I would like to cover a few housekeeping items. So for everyone who is participating over the phone, all lines will be muted upon entry to the webinar to reduce background noises that can disrupt the quality of the audio transmission. To ask a question, please send it to me over the chat or using the Q&A section. To access the chat while in full screen, hover your mouse towards the top of the screen, a menu will drop down, click on the speech bubble, and then enter your question. There will be a brief time for questions at points throughout the webinar, as well as a longer Q&A session at the end. And I will relay any questions that appear in the chat to our speaker during those appropriate times. If you have a troubleshooting question, I will respond to you in the chat, just one-on-one to try to get anything fixed. This event will be recorded and archived on the NUIPIC TMDL page on our website. Within the next couple of weeks, you will be able to download the recording, the presentation slides, as well as some supplementary materials. You should receive an email when that goes up. At the conclusion of the webinar, you'll receive a pop-up link to a survey where you can provide feedback on this webinar. We are interested in feedback on the topics we addressed, logistics of the webinar, and any suggestions for future webinar topics. We will use the evaluations to continue to try and improve this webinar experience. These evaluations are also taken into consideration when choosing future topics. For a complete list of resources for this webinar, including presentations and any handouts and links, as well as for any more information on this webinar series, please visit our TMDL webinar page, and this and future webinars will, like I said, be archived for downloading in the future. This webinar will utilize poll questions, so please pay special attention for when these polls go out and try to answer in a timely fashion. This will occur a few points throughout the webinar, and we're looking to increase on this webinar experience. The immediate feedback from these poll questions will help Dr. Dukes provide the most relevant information on public engagement. Thank you for joining us today. Here's my contact information if you have any questions afterwards. They'll be up at the end of the webinar as well. I think we're ready to get started, so I'll now hand it over to Dr. Frank Dukes.
Okay, Jasper. Hey, good afternoon, those of you that are not on the West Coast or farther west, and good morning for those of you that are on the West Coast or farther west. And I'm glad to be here. Let me see if I want to put this on full screen. I think that might be helpful for everybody. And we are good. So, and thanks, Jasper. And also there's an advisory group. I'm not sure if that's the right term, but a number of people, and I'll probably omit some of the names, so I'm not going to try to say all of them, but who were very helpful. And we had a couple of calls, and I know they've been doing some work beforehand, looking at what were the types of issues that people are having challenges with and would be interested in speaking about from my experience. My experience is I'm with something called the Institute for Environmental Negotiation at the University of Virginia, and I've been here since 1990, and a little bit different probably than most of you, because our role is as mediators, facilitators, consensus builders, people that help foster civic engagement, help consult with developing public engagement strategies, all sorts of issues, but we've done an awful lot of work on water quality, including TMDLs. I'm going to be focusing on 3 cases to illustrate some of the themes for today. And they are actually not concrete TMDL cases themselves, although all 3 rivers have TMDLs on them. But anyway, I want to offer that sort of appreciation for everybody. and we'll see if the technology works. Hopefully everyone's able to see. I'm trying to see, so I might for a minute. I was trying to move to the next slide, and when we were practicing, it sometimes took me a couple times to, there we go. So it's coming up now. So what we're going to cover today, so challenges and rewards of engaging stakeholders, then an introduction to collaboration and consensus building and why that's a useful approach for ways of engaging stakeholders. Then just starting off pretty early with how not to build consensus, what I've learned from my own and from others' mistakes. I thought at one point I might do a little bit more with that and realized maybe that's not, we probably all have lots of experience with things that we don't want to do and want more with good ways of doing things. And also then moving into the core values of public participation. So there's the International Association for Public Participation. I hope that many of you might be familiar with them, and we'll look at the core values that organization has promulgated, why they're useful. And then they also have a nice matrix of ways of engaging people based on the particular goals that you might have. Recognizing there are a lot of people, we have 125 people on the call so far. People have different questions, different domains, different interests, so obviously not going to be able to satisfy the key questions of everybody with the generic presentation, but we will save enough time at the end for questions and answers. And if you stick with me towards the end, I'll actually identify for you the photos, all photos that I took of different water bodies. And you can guess about what they are in their intro, but I'm not going to reveal them until we get to the end of the presentation too. And then finally, in the bulk of the process, the bulk of the webinar is really going to be about structure. How do you get an authentic, effective engagement? And I'm going to use 3 case studies and go through the 3 case studies for different components of this structure. So we're going to be reinforcing those. And I picked the 3 cases because they're all very different situations, and all take different approaches to them. So I want you to sort of reflect on this question, the first question: what are the types of challenges you face or are facing now related to stakeholder engagement? And that will be helpful to be thinking about that throughout. But I wonder, Jasper, if you could actually pose that as a polling question as well, so we might be able to see what comes up for folks.
All right, will do.
So I'm going to pause to allow you to think about that and then also to be able to answer the polling. So I'm wondering, Jasper, I'm not seeing anything on my screen, but I don't know if I would be seeing anything on my screen. But wondering if you know whether that has gone out.
It's going out right now.
Okay, and I do see it on the screen. So we're not going to give a huge amount of time for this. I think maybe about 30 seconds more, maybe up to about a minute for people to be able to do that. So if you've got some challenges, and we'll get a sense of what challenges there are, and then I might be able to address some of those more specifically if my presentation doesn't address those too. So why don't we give about 10 more seconds. And then Jasper, why don't you go ahead and close the poll?
It's closing in 15.
Okay.
So it's an automatic thing at this point.
And I wonder, while it's closing, can I move forward to the next slide?
You should be able to. It's closed now, though.
Okay.
Get the result.
I don't see it popping up yet. Okay, and I do see the poll starting to pop up. So these are some of the challenges that I heard from people when we were doing some of the planning beforehand, and some based on my own experience as we're waiting for the poll results to come up. So certainly the idea of a public that is angry and dealing with emotions, and particularly intense emotions. The kind of opposite, and I know that's a concern for a lot of people, when you really need to get public input and you have a very hard time attracting participation of the public at public meetings or other events. I think another one, the varying levels of knowledge within the public, is a common one, and kind of like what we have here, that I know some of you have been doing this work for a very long time and would feel very well qualified at leading this webinar, and others of you may have only been working for a few months or a few years, and may feel as though you still have a lot left to learn. My hope is that actually I still feel like I have a lot left to learn, so but there are varying levels of knowledge. And then I think sometimes people come to meetings expecting to be able to vent about something else, and how do you address that? I know it's also a time and energy drain that takes a lot of resources to do engagement effectively. And I see there's a typo on this next one, but looking at some of the states around the country that might have really substantial regulations, but very little actual guidance and support for authentic engagement. So so that expectation of support is sometimes problematic for people. So Jasper, I don't actually see any results. So either nobody answered the poll, or we've got a glitch with that. So I'm just going to move on and see that whether or not those will be coming up for.
All right, we did get the results, and it should have gone out. I'll work on figuring out how to get that to you. We did get some results.
Okay. Well, I wasn't even, the value of this is really having people thinking about what are the challenges and what might you be able to get out of the webinar and be able to address those challenges. So I'm going to go to the next page, and so going to talk about actually some of the rewards of engaging stakeholders. So I don't know, my guess is that some of you actually do not think of engagement as a rewarding activity, and I'm not going to ask you to submit a poll or do a poll for that, but really to think about what types of rewards have you experienced related to stakeholder engagement. And part of this is what you plan for. What you seek is often what you end up getting a better chance of getting. So if we don't know what we want to get out of stakeholder engagement, we don't know concretely what we want to get out of it, then we may not be planning the right ways to be able to get the most out of that engagement. So just some of the biggest rewards that I found, and also that the literature on engagement would say. I think this one the most obvious, the idea of having creative, legitimate, and enduring outcomes, enduring and legitimate because of the fact that other people have been engaged in helping formulate those outcomes. Of course, the idea that they're politically and economically and socially feasible, that if you haven't done appropriate engagement, that you may come up with plans that aren't either politically or economically or socially feasible. But learning and change among participants, so that most of us tend to work in certain geographic regions. I know there's some exceptions, or at least certain geographic regions over a period of time, and tend to work with certain stakeholders that tend to be repeat players. And so we're not only, as we're doing whether it's a TMDL implementation plan or a water quality plan or something else, we're not only working on that plan, we're actually building capacity for future work that we do too. Can't underestimate the value of personal and working relationships that can be developed with appropriate engagement. Social political capital, for when you're not able to do such a good job that you actually have that capital that you've invested in. People will not say, aha, we knew it was not going to be done right. We knew you didn't care about it. We knew you weren't doing the right research or whatever. They would say there must be something wrong. We need to figure it out with you. And then shared information, of course, that all can understand and accept. And then there's a couple of writers, a couple of researchers, Judy Innes, David Booher, and I'm going to refer to them in a little bit, that talk about second-order effects. So not what you intended necessarily by engagement, that you actually, though, get other effects that might be really quite valuable, spin-off partnerships, collaborative activities, new practices, even new institutions that were not part of what you had planned to begin with. So all of these possible, they don't all happen, but all are possible, that are only possible actually through engaging other people. So into some of the more direct challenges with public participation. I mentioned Innes and Booher, and they've got a great article where they sort of challenge traditional public participations. And one of the quotes that these methods have an almost sacred quality, and they stay in place despite all that everyone knows is wrong with them, partly because we may not know other ways of doing things. But essentially they're finding, and many others, that legally required do not work, at least in the sense that they don't work in the sense of achieving genuine participation or satisfaction or improving decisions or incorporating a broad spectrum of the public. I know there are exceptions to this, but the fact is that there are lots and lots of research that would confirm that. And then they often, in fact, if we have traditional public meetings, for instance, they often antagonize members of the public who do try to work with them. We often feel like citizens are pitted against each other. They feel compelled to use their 1 minute or 2 minutes or 3 minutes, whatever the case might be, to get their issues across as opposed to developing learning and understanding. So it makes it tough for you all, those of you that are agency, with agencies, public agencies, or head water organizations or whatever the case might be, to say what really is public input. So all those critiques are, in fact, why people don't participate. And just to add some that you are probably aware of, they don't feel themselves valued, or they don't think that their ideas and concerns will actually make a difference. No one is listening. And then for those of us that do a lot of work in the public, we may forget that actually there are a lot of people that are intimidated or fearful of or suspicious of public meetings and hearings. And the idea of the formality and the microphones and the signing up ahead of time and the idea that there are certain people that have expertise and others that don't is not meant for me. Sometimes people have made substantial efforts and those have been unsuccessful. So, and then moving to some of my own experience with this, and I first started developing this actually to relate something non-water quality, but I started to see this in other areas, in particular with school redistricting, and might create a groan from those of you that are parents that may have gone through school redistricting. I've seen this, of course, in water quality issues as well. But limiting the flow of information, the idea that actually information, and there may be good reasons that you might think about this. Information may be incomplete, or it's too easy to misinterpret it, or it's still under review. But let me ask you, what are the costs of people knowing that you have information that they do not, or learning that they have information that they do not? And is it worth it really to limit that or to share with the qualifications that you might have to have? I think this is also very common. Begin with a proposed solution or potential solutions. So, we've got option 1, 2, and 3. Give us your best input. What often that does, where in fact it may be an effort to put something out for people to take just to get the conversation started. Many people would see this as, in fact, confirm that you already know what you want or privileging your own views. Constraining participation. Oftentimes people have asked, well, we can't have too many people at this meeting, or we need to limit the numbers of people at a particular meeting. So again, there can be a basis of real concern for that. We can't talk to many people, or this do we really have to include this person because they always tend to go off a tangent. But again, thinking about what are the implications of that and how it's too easily translate into us working with like-minded people. I'm going to be given an example of one of the rivers I'm going to be using is the Elizabeth River, and there's Elizabeth River Project, and they actually have a principle where they identify who are the potential opposition to something first, or who are the people that are going to have the biggest concerns, and they go to them first. They go to them before anybody else to avoid doing just that sort of constraining of participation. Now let's see. Now Jasper, my website, or I'm sorry, the display's actually changed a little bit right now, and so it's gotten flatter, and I didn't do anything with the screen, so I'm not sure there's anything, I don't see anything that I could do differently. So it moved into depersonalizing opposition and the idea that actually blaming individuals as opposed to saying there's something wrong with them, as opposed to identifying the issues and addressing the issues. And then limiting your expectations that engagement can actually contribute to anything, as opposed to the expectation that engagement might actually be really useful for you. And then finally making this business as usual. If you have these practices over and over again, that you might have, in fact, create a reputation for not really wanting engagement and having a problem with people. So I think enough on that. I'm going to be optimistic and hope that we go to the next slide and it's going to show up okay, and it does actually. So how do we make this work better? And my suggestion is that we reconceive of community involvement as actually collaboration and consensus building. And I'll sometimes use those terms interchangeably, but moving away from simply the idea of community involvement, which people tend to think of in terms of how do we hold meetings, and thinking more in terms of how can we actually see the different stakeholders, members of the public, different organizations as collaborators, even though they may have very different roles, even though you may have a role that's most accountable, but nonetheless they might be able to help you collaborate and build consensus. And I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by those. So reconceiving that. Again, Innes and Booher talk about the fact that we need to move away from public involvement, and that in fact participation, as you see that quote on the upper right, citizens and other players work in formal and informal ways to influence action before it's virtually a foregone conclusion. And their suggestion is participation has to be collaborative, right? And that they actually are starting to see people doing this. And again, it's not this one-way communication, multidimensional model. There's a lot of literature on that. I'm really not going to go into the literature at all, but you can look up collaborative governance, collaboration public policy, collaboration environment, collaboration watershed. You'll find a lot of similar thoughts about that, mostly due to the failures that have occurred in the past for people. So one organization that really helps foster an expanded view of public participation, I mentioned at the start, the International Association for Public Participation. And this is probably a good time. I should have mentioned it a little bit earlier. So I will mention a link again. And Jasper, I'm not sure if there's a way of posting it for everybody, that link, but I've developed a shared folder that has these core values of public participation, and it has several other documents that I will be discussing, including the PowerPoint itself, and I've got that in a PDF too. What IAP2 promotes is the idea of authentic public participation. If we're going to invest time in it, we need to do it authentically. So I'm not going to go over each of the different dimensions of that, but it's a powerful tool and one that can actually be shared with others, so that to help diminish some of the suspicion that people might have about why you are doing public participation. And another document that they do that's really quite good, and you're not going to be able to read it here, but you can go to that link, which I hope Jasper will be able to share, and which will be at the end of the PowerPoint too.
I'm putting the link into the chat right now.
Okay, okay. And is a spectrum of public participation, and I'm just going to touch on it briefly right now, but I think it's really valuable, and there's others. The Department of the Interior has done something. There's others that have done this spectrum too, recognizing that you have different goals and different promises made to the public and different techniques that you use depending on what your goal is. So if you only think, well, public engagement is one thing, you may only respond one way. But there's public engagement that helps inform, only one way. Consultation, limited. Involvement would be less limited. And then collaborate, we're actually working together, versus empower, we're actually the leadership or the agency or governing body would in fact be giving over decision authority. As we look at the cases I'm describing, most of the time we're looking at different dimensions of all of them. So if we're doing a TMDL implementation plan, there may be some element of informing, some of consulting, and some of collaborating at the same time. There, we just want to offer that they have other resources. It's a great resource for work that you might be doing. So, turning back to collaboration. So if we're going to be moving towards collaboration, what do we mean by that? I think people have a general understanding of that. One of the most simple and powerful one, simply joint ownership of decisions. So where actually you are not the only person who's taking ownership of decisions and for achieving the jointly agreed to objectives. Barbara Gray at Penn State. And another one, again, probably not unfamiliar, shared decision making. All parties with a stake in a problem constructively explore their differences, and then they're developing a joint strategy. And then again, going to Innes and Booher, talking about the fact that, in fact, they're becoming part of an emerging governance system. We're seeing this more systematized, that people see the value in making it easier to do this sort of engagement, this sort of collaboration on a regular basis. And the more you do it, the more accomplished you get at doing that. When we talk about collaborative consensus building, I'm talking about specifically where you're having direct face-to-face discussions as opposed to discussions filtered through other sorts of media, where the deliberation is intended to actually help your mutual education and understanding. So being explicit about educating and understanding as opposed to, all right, we've got a time for public talk, tell us whatever you want to tell us about, and then we'll take it back to our room and we'll come up with whatever plan we want to have. Doesn't mean it's not conflictual. Can be conflictual, but it's intended to focus on education and understanding. Strong focus on transparency and inclusion. We'll say more about that later. And then adaptability of the process to participant needs. So, this is one of the answers to getting people to participate who might be hard to participate. And lots and lots of circumstances where we've gone to faith communities, had community picnics, done boat tours, ways of meeting people on their own terms and asking them how they best would be, how they might best be engaged. And I'm going to do a shout out to Nesha McCrae, who I hope is on the webinar, and I might be asking you for a question about one way that you did something very good with the Smith Creek TMDL several years ago. And then also oftentimes where consensus, not majority vote, is a basis for decisions, where you're actually looking at, can we get a shared will? Can we get the sense of the whole group as opposed to majority for being able to make decisions, a way of reducing the sort of alienation that certain individuals may have if they feel a greater sense of power and control over the decisions. And then they may or may not include a third-party mediator or facilitator. Often they do. Certainly, if it's a highly contentious issue, that can be wise to do that, and other times maybe as well. So, so what we're going to do the rest of the session is offering a framework for basically building consensus for better outcomes, but through stakeholder engagement. And I'm going to offer 6 sort of key themes for this, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go through some of these cases and take a look at how each of these themes we've enacted in these different cases and some of the lessons that we've learned from that. So the first one, conducting a situation assessment, a formal or informal one, basically to understand the people or issues. And depending on the circumstances or the resources, you may have very little time to do that. Still important to be able to understand who are the key parties, what are the key issues, what ways have people been participating, what ways do they want to participate. And those can range from, again, informal to actually really substantial ones. And I'll be sharing an example of a really substantial one. Developing a shared purpose and goal. It sounds like that's obvious, but in fact, it's often not the case, that there needs to be a well-defined and shared purpose. It has to be real, has to be practical, and has to be one that's actually shared by everybody. Doesn't mean that if you're a convener that you don't have very strong purpose and goals as well that need to be offered up front, but recognizing that people participating may have additional goals as well, and it may help you reach your goals by engaging their goals as well. A third element, is making clear that you have an effective structure and process. So well-defined decision rules, well-defined process rules that are supported by, and if possible, at least shared in the development by members of whatever group or community that you're going to be working with. So we'll talk a little bit more about each of these, including that one. And then a fourth one, inclusion, outreach, effective representation. And I know that's a key element for a lot of people. How can we do that appropriately? Fifth one then, sustained dialogue, the idea that you have to continue both giving up prematurely or finding success prematurely. And this does not mean the absence of conflict or disagreement. In fact, we want to encourage candor. The most effective dialogue is one where people actually are able to really disagree with each other, but they're able to do so in ways that they understood with each other. They understand one another. And then last, evaluation and learning from this. So another way of looking at this, I hope you can read that on your screen. It could be thought of as a linear process, beginning with the situation assessment, developing your purpose and goals, defining what sort of structure and process you'll use for engagement, making sure you're doing outreach and representation, and then the work that you're doing in the discussion and sustaining that, and then evaluation and learning. But in reality, and there is some element of linearity, but in fact it's more like this, that you're continuing to revisit each of these, and you're certainly learning and evaluating as you move into a process. So let's get into some really concrete cases to be able to take a better look at this. And I picked these are all on the east, unfortunately. I've done work on the west, but these are all cases I've worked on the last year, or at least all rivers that I've worked on the last year. The Money Point case was earlier, but so I know them intimately, and they're current, and they all have different issues, and I tried to find water issues that might be of interest to as broad a spectrum as possible. So the Elizabeth River, in particular one location at Money Point, it's urban, it's heavily industrialized, 3 Superfund sites, many brownfield sites, military installations, opens up into the Chesapeake Bay, another an estuary that has tremendous resource, but also tremendous problems too. The Dan River in North Carolina and Virginia, and in particular the concern with the river that there was a Duke Energy facility that had a massive coal ash release, 35,000 tons, I think, or so, of coal ash, the liquid and ash itself, and that is a river that had a sort of emergent recreation and tourism. Some of the towns and cities started to turn their redevelopment towards the river, an area that had a lot of economic change in the past couple of decades, with the decline in tobacco, the decline in manufacturing, decline in, textile manufacturing and wood furniture manufacturing and so forth. And then as they are turning towards the river for value, you've got this coal ash release. Also includes a natural resources damage assessment and recovery NERDAR process as part of that too. And then the last one that I want to talk about, the Clinch River, which is also rural, very high ecological value. I don't know if those of you might want to look it up, but we're always quoting the Nature Conservancy as saying one of the most biologically diverse rivers in all of North America, river of global significance, biological hotspot. And it's on the border of and also within the coal fields in Virginia and Tennessee, so it has some particular issues. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually go through the 6 elements and using what we've done with these as sort of touch points for these different rivers, because they're different lessons for each one of these. So, the first element, the conducting a situation assessment, and just to review that, in situations with complexity, basically good practice to conduct an assessment. Concerns, needs, and interests before proceeding. And again, that can be done informally, it can be done formally. And I put a little bit of literature, a document that my institute uses for conducting stakeholder assessments, and I put the stakeholder assessments that we did for the Elizabeth River and for the Dan River in that folder for you all to be able to take a look at. Certainly need to be flexible, how those assessments can be conducted, and to follow the leads offered by individual parties to give an understanding of the situation, better relationship with those parties. I know there's some large situations where people are actually hired outside the process to do these assessments and they turn them over. My experience has been that for projects that I'm about to work on that have some sort of substantial conflict or substantial issues at stake, that I or I and my partners end up doing these assessments ourselves, partly to better understand, partly also to develop a better relationship with the parties that might be involved with this as well. So let me give some examples. In the Elizabeth River, again, this is the urban river that opens up onto the Chesapeake Bay, 3 Superfund sites. And we focused on, in this case, I've done work on a number of areas with them, but in this case, Money Point, the most heavily contaminated. There was brownfield funding that had been applied for. Developed the questions for this assessment with the Elizabeth River Project, which is the nonprofit that ended up taking the lead on the revitalization of this Money Point area, this heavily contaminated area. So didn't just come up with those questions myself. And then because of the scope, actually partnered with a community organization. So I conducted some in-person interviews, but most of mine were by telephone. And then I actually was able to get some funding to contract with the community organization that then could go door to door in the neighborhoods and talk with people. And I should have looked up the numbers of people, pretty substantial. I think we had 50-some people that we ended up talking to about the Elizabeth River, and particularly the Elizabeth River at Money Point, this contaminated area. Invite interviewees to suggest other people to speak to. And the key question will focus on how might we be able to shape this revitalization process. So they didn't just call it a cleanup, even though that was the focus of it, but the cleanup for what? The cleanup actually to make this an area that people would want to be able to use in ways they hadn't been using it before. So just one snapshot, and I've got this on the folder, the shared folder, just some of the interview protocol that we would develop ahead of time, and name and affiliation, why we're doing this, how we are going to be using this, a written assessment, recommendations for a process, offering people confidentiality. We will certainly use their answers to put together a report, but we will not quote anybody or use those answers in such a way that anybody could be identified. And then those are some of the initial questions. We had more than that, but just beginning, how do you know about it, your relationship to the area, the challenges, assets, and so forth. So that was Elizabeth River, the situation assessment. For the Dan, again, remind you, that was with there had been a coal ash release and that Duke Energy was responsible for. So there was the NERDAR process, the formal process. There was actually litigation. There were other regulatory processes that were going on at the same time. Duke Energy also said, you know what, we really think we need to engage the communities directly, and how do we do that? And so contacted my institute at the University of Virginia, and ultimately I partnered with someone from Virginia Cooperative Extension who was in Danville, which was sort of the heart of the release. It was actually a couple dozen miles downstream from it, but the largest city impacted by the release. And conducting an assessment of that, and Duke Energy funded it, so we were upfront with people about them funding it, that we're doing this because Duke Energy has approached us about possibly facilitating a community consensus building process to say, what did the community want to see Duke Energy do? So we developed these questions with Duke Energy, partnered with this local extension specialist, and then invited interviewees that we've been suggested to speak to suggest to others that would be appropriate to talk to. And the key question of this, there were a number of questions, but really, should we work with Duke Energy and the community to convene a stakeholder group? Is this going to be legitimate? Does the community really want to see this happen? So we had a contract with Duke Energy, but it was actually a contract just to do the assessment first. Because if the answer was, no way, we don't trust Duke Energy, or we just don't think this is a good idea to participate, or we've got lawsuits, we're gonna take our chances in the court, then we weren't going to proceed with it. But the actually unanimous, everybody we spoke to said, oh yeah, Duke Energy needs to be meeting with community members directly, and they need to pay for it. So it ended up not being an issue with that at all. And again, I've got the situation assessment and the results. It was not confidential. Certainly what we didn't quote anybody by name or in ways that people would know who said what. But again, we did this whole protocol for that as well. So both of those, the Elizabeth River and Dan River, spending a couple of months before actually engaging in work on that, before actually first meetings with stakeholders about what's going on with this, what are the issues at stake, and particularly asking, what do you think, what sort of process is going to be helpful, what's not helpful, who should be involved with it, so that by the time we actually gather people together, we can point to the assessment and say, hey, we've got some pretty good results from these interviews. We've talked to a wide, diverse group of people. We let people know who we've talked to, and there's legitimacy for that effort. For the Clinch, so the Clinch River, again, the one in the coal fields, biologically diverse, right on the edge where there's a lot of mountaintop mining going, so a lot of controversy about the role of mining, about the future of the region. Our focus was on the Clinch in Virginia, a four-county region in Virginia, and that actually took longer to do because unlike the Elizabeth River, where there was a nonprofit that was leading this, or the Dan River, where Duke Energy was clear, or other cases that we worked on, where it might be a TMDL, where you've got an agency that has a lead. There was no lead on this. It was simply my institute at the University of Virginia, public university, saying there are challenges here for a variety of reasons. We've been hearing about some of the challenges, and would it be helpful for us to help bring people together to talk about those challenges? So we took longer to do that. In-person visits and calls, class interviews, group discussions, and the key question here, would the region find value in my institute bringing together stakeholders to talk about the future of the region? So actually ended up doing almost a year and a half of that, not full-time, but substantial. And just again, we did the protocol for that, and just some of the key themes that emerged from this, from the report. Assets and strengths and challenges, future of coal and gas, economic diversification. So see, a lot of those actually don't have to do with the river itself, even though everything was centered around the river, which was helpful when we actually convened our first meeting. So, so some different ways of doing that situation assessment. The second element, the key element that I talked about, the idea that you actually have to have really clear purpose and shared purpose and goals, actually, that it's not just that it's clear, but actually that that the purpose and goals is shared by everybody. So, excuse me, trying to get this to move forward. Real practical, shared by the group. A convener certainly needs to be offered up front, maybe really substantial, but recognizing group members have additional goals as well. So, Elizabeth River, the heavily rural, the heavily urbanized 3 Superfund sites. Military installations, cleaning up one particular area. Their initial goal that they shared with everybody, this vision, a corridor revitalization plan, and the focus on remediation of offshore sediment contamination and preventing further contamination. And that was this was their #1 hotspot, the #1 place along the whole river, and they were candid about what they wanted to do. By process of engagement, in our very first meeting, we asked people what their vision is, what they wanted to see happen, and then spent some time shaping this over a period of time. We ended up with these as the goals that the stakeholders had, so we convened a group, and this was what the group ended up saying would be their goals. And so there were goals and actions ended up being all around these 5 key goals. And you'll recognize certainly the first 2 are very similar to what the Elizabeth River project had said, but the third one came out of this engagement process. Enhancing community quality of life, the coexistence industry. The fourth one, establishing environmental stewardship as the industrial ethic. Again, that came out of our meetings. The fifth one, creating this integrated network of habitat. Again, that came out of actually bringing people together and saying, what would make this worth your time? We know we want to do the cleanup. We know we want to prevent upland pollution, but there may be other elements that are related to these as well. So those ended up being the shared purpose and goal by which everybody agreed that they would judge the success of the project. For the Dan River, again, the one where they had the coal ash release, so Duke Energy had initially offered their goals as really clear, and so I'm just quoting what their goals were. Fully engaging the diverse community stakeholders to understanding their needs, concerns, and interests. The second part is trying to seek consensus for actions that Duke Energy might take. And then the third part, that they would then establish long-term positive relationships with affected communities, not just Duke Energy, but each of the different communities. As we heard in doing our assessment, many of the communities sort of bemoaned the fact that actually they weren't connected with each other. They didn't talk with each other. There's a state line that is there, and there's city and county boundaries, and they really needed to think of themselves as one region. What we ended up having then from the stakeholder team members offering their own vision and goals, and they had many. And I'm going to offer these, but I'm going to go through them quickly, not read them because there are too many. But they were broken down into 4 categories, but we didn't invite them to say, tell us your process goals, tell us your knowledge goals, tell us your future action prevention goals, tell us your reputation goals. Instead, we just asked them to say what your vision goals, and then we ended up categorizing for easier understanding. So, and again, I'm not going to give you enough time to see these. If you want to take time, you can actually see it. They're in the report, and they're also in the PowerPoint that we have. But the process goals, knowledge goals, and these came out of the meetings, but they also came out of our initial assessment. And the future action and prevention goals. And the reputation was a considerable element of the concern that the communities had, particularly communities that were starting to turn towards the rivers for redevelopment and outdoor recreation and so forth. So, so we shared these. We made these public. They were very visible, and they said these are the goals that you all have articulated that we want to be judged by, whether or not, as we move forward with this process, that you'll be able to say you met those goals. And then eventually we put together a stakeholder group, and then eventually, over a period of time, this is what they came up with, sort of synthesizing those different goals. And then they came up with, and you can see in the report, different actions for each of these. Criteria, we're using the term criteria, they're really goals, but that they would be counteracting the negative perceptions, effectiveness in addressing the challenges, measurable results, again, the benefits of the solutions distributed through the basin, so it's not just one area. And sustainable meaning not just in the environmental sense, but actually actions that will last beyond, the point that Duke Energy might be funding them. So again, the importance of those. The Clinch River, again, the one in the coal fields. Initial meeting, when we had done the 1.5 years of assessment, we had an initial meeting and invited them to consider their vision and goals. And then follow-up conversations resulted in this initial set on the next page. So I'm going to move to that. So connecting efforts, peoples and localities, vibrancy of communities, downtown revitalization, strategic planning, outdoor recreation, all these terms that people mention. The strong, catalyze on the strong ecological assets. Remember, the Clinch is one of the most biologically rich rivers in the world. So can we do that to build our local economies? Identify the opportunities for strengthening the connection between revitalization and outdoor recreation. Build upon the unique nature of the Clinch. What some people talked about was, they had done, this is an area that has very high unemployment, and they do sort of traditional economic development where you are, recruiting companies, but companies come and go. And somebody said, you can't outsource the Clinch. You can't outsource the culture. You can't outsource the beauty. You can't outsource the aesthetics. So let's build on that element of that. And what we ended up then doing over a period of time with several meetings, and the vision and goals have been stabilized. So their vision statement, which you can find on clinchriverva.com, that people adopt that by 2020 a global destination, and that it's integrating economic, environmental, and social benefits. So again, we've got the environment is really up front there, and that's why many people are participating, the Nature Conservancy, other organizations, but seeing that there are ways to do that that have to engage other people as well. And then 5 goals, a state park, access points, trails, and campgrounds that give people access, enhancing the water quality. Without that, you can't do anything. And then environmental education opportunities, and then finally the downtown revitalization. So those ended up being the shared goals from people. in the Clinch River. So all three of these examples where there's very clear shared purpose and goals, all of them beginning with one set of goals and then expanding to incorporate those from other people. All right, the third element, effective structure and process. So you need to have well-defined decision rules and process rules. In this case, while we did, certainly there's a substantial element of just plain community meetings. Each of these circumstances I'm talking about ended up having stakeholder groups, stakeholder advisory groups, some group that met over a period of time. With the Clinch River, that group was quite fluid. I'm sorry, with the Elizabeth River, that group was quite fluid, and we ended up having some 80 people participate at different times in different meetings, with a core group of maybe 20 people that were really the core of all of that. With the Dan River, it was a appointed, selected group, and so it had fixed membership. And then the Clinch is more like the Elizabeth. There's a core group of people, about 25 people, and then we've had actually more than 100 people that come and participate in some of the meetings too. So for the structure and process, just giving some examples of this. For Elizabeth River structure and process, there was a task force convened, as I said, approximately 80 participants at some point. 6 whole group meetings of the task force conducted over 18 months. A lot of work that was being done in between. So technical consultants that would go off and conduct some research and interact with stakeholders in between sessions. Community outreach to targeted groups, and I'll talk about the community outreach more later. And then multiple ad hoc work groups focused on actions within the goals of the plan. All these, none of this was developed beforehand. They knew there would be a task force of some sort, but this all emerged from what the needs were for that particular group. And then a community celebration as part of that. For the Dan River structure and process, so there were actually a number of ideas from the assessment interviews. There were some for the Elizabeth too, but I just thought I would just show these so that we actually had this sort of start, all interests represented, define, be clear about what Duke is meaning by they're going to take responsibility. So before we start a process, make sure that Duke is being held accountable for saying, or for meaning what they say. More of these, tangible deliverables, ways of reaching out to people, making it transparent, and so forth. So, and then we have this, the Dan River process. So making this visible, I like to do this. This is actually using Excel, and I've got this on the shared folder that the link will take you to. There's an Excel spreadsheet, and you can just do this using just simple Excel to do flowcharts and so forth. So I'm not going to read all those different elements of that. And you can see the proposed process that worked and identified with people as we convened these. So this wasn't what we said, here's what we're going to do. We said, what you hear the needs that we've heard you say, what are the best ways that we can reach those needs? So in other words, if we're looking to the far right, if we want to have a whole suite of effective and legitimate solutions that are distributed widely throughout the whole watershed, what do we have to do? How do we work our way backwards? So identifying the issues, building knowledge, reaching out to the public, developing criteria that we evaluate options, reviewing and deliberating about those options, and then coming up with a suite, making decisions about that. So this is one component of making that process visible. Another component of this, talking and sharing with people after the first meeting. So there was a proposed process that was developed after the first meeting, and then eventually edited to this. So being clear about that, so people asked us at the first meeting, can you do something that will show us where we expect to be by 6 meetings? We ended up having more than 6 meetings, but planned it at least for 6 meetings. So at the first meeting we had already done this, but at the second meeting, all right, we'll finalize group protocols. We're going to discuss requested information. We're going to begin to identify potential solutions. In between meetings, research for additional information. So letting people see this, make this visible beforehand, and recognizing that there is a process. It's not just people coming together and we meet and then we say, well, what do we want to do at our next meeting? That there's a structure that's intended to take us to these outcomes ahead of time, and the structure is transparent. It's flexible, it's adaptable. You know, it needs to be set up and adapted to what participant needs are, but it's something that's there. And then just the second part of this for meetings 3 through 7, some of the elements we do with that. I'm going to move, the next one just shows overall. You can't read that really, but just to show you what this can look like, what a particular process diagram can look like all in one place. So you've got the sort of broad picture, you've got some of the specifics of what you're going to do between meetings, you've got the little little clouds on the middle left and middle right that talk about community engagement and an interactive website, and so forth. So just sort of a hint, that's something that's useful, even if you don't have that, you still need to have a real clear process. So, and then finally, the Clinch River, the one in the coal fields, our structure and process evolved based on the participant needs: monthly steering committee calls, quarterly in-person meetings, consensus-based decision-making, bi-weekly newsletters, active website, social media presence, and then the main bulk of the work is actually being done in active action groups. So again, this was not a process imposed on them. This was a process that emerges with the best way that people needed to structure this. And there were lots and lots of discussion. Do we incorporate? Is this the best way for us to work together? So it's taken some time to get into this particular rhythm for this. Inclusion, outreach, and effective representation. So number 4, the key themes for this. And I know that's a key concern for a lot of people. So just to give you some different examples, well, first starting out that, in fact, collaborative processes need to include representatives of all relevant, significantly different interests. Doesn't mean it has to include everybody, but all relevant and significantly different interests. And it also needs to be right mix of participants. If we're not diverse enough, we're going to have too many like-minded people. If we are we need to have people that are maybe that their strength is not working in action groups and working between meetings, but maybe they've got the right connections. So looking at and relying on the people who have the most at stake to figure out what are the needs that we have for this, and then reaching out to the general public too. So for Elizabeth River, just briefly, some of the examples. We had 2 community dinners at the start before we actually started the process to sort of share what might what's going on with Elizabeth River, what might need to happen, get to know people informally. During the process, we had 1 meeting held on a large tour boat, so that gives people an informal chance to engage each other. Invited people beyond the stakeholders who were actually part of the advisory group, members of the public to come, and everybody wants to go on a boat tour. Community outreach to the neighborhood, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more specific. Community celebration at the end of this, honoring keepers of the vision. So individual art that donated by university art professor and students to participants. And then you see this photo on the right-hand side is actually, these are a cement mixing plant, and these are some of the tall towers, and that's a huge art installation that was floating down at the finish of the ceremony. It was the release of this plan had a couple hundred people participate in it. Lots of publicity for that. Also, the Elizabeth River and Money Point was in an area that had basically used to be a large residential area, but it moved into largely industry and commercial use. But there was still a church there, primarily African American community church, and so was able to get, because I'm at the university, to get a class to focus on engaging this church and actually doing a community history that focused a lot on the church, not exclusively. I'm doing a picnic at the church, doing a tree planting in the church also. So ways of engaging people, and then being able to share what the work was, and being able to ask them what that would benefit them from that. So really substantial engagement from communities that sometimes don't participate actively in water quality issues. Just some art that was developed, an example of the art that was shared, that everybody who participated got a really nice individual piece of art celebrating this. Dan River then, so outreach and representation, community meetings certainly, all the sessions of this invited group were made open to the public. If you look for small groups to encourage ideas, lots of publicity, and then interactive website. I had a group of students that went through 50 different companies that had different types of web-based engagement, and they ended up picking this one called Engaging Plans. The Urban Interactive Studio. It's actually still up there, even though we gave up ownership of it quite a while ago, so it's not active anymore. But if you were to Google Dan River Community Stakeholder or Dan River Region Community Forum there.org, at the bottom of there, you can actually still find that. I think, and then community information forum for Dan River, just some example of having instructions, really paying attention, not just inviting people to come, but thinking carefully about the process. So on this one, asking people to identify where's their geographic location, and then on a map, where you're concerned. So they can write it on a Post-it note, or they can stick it on a map, or they can write it directly, or they can go to somebody who's recording that. And then just a general graffiti wall up there for people to write Post-it notes and stick them. Concerned, ideas for solution, and then information tables and so forth. And I would just say that I think that meeting ended up really was well done, and we had lots of participants. We had a second meeting that we did not do as much, and my thinking is that that was probably because there were fewer participants that were as concerned by the impact of the coal ash at that point. That was almost a year later than there had been at the initial time period. Okay, and then the Clinch River. Lots of different ways of inclusion. So there's actually, they were able to get some funding to do sort of labeling and marketing. So the hometowns of the Clinch, there's lots of signage now, the access points and so forth that have the same theme. And you can see this hometowns of the Clinch is a whole week of local communities that are focusing on the Clinch. There's a really good website that is kept up to date. And again, you can see the logo on the upper left-hand side. And people have developed hats and stickers and shirts and other sorts of material. And then we've also make sure that we disperse the meetings throughout the watershed so that it's not just centrally located. We're going to all 4 counties and going into different parts in the counties as well, so that everybody's valued. And then at different places, we have meetings at country stores, restaurants, community centers, college campus, picnic shelters, you name it. Practically any place we've had meetings located there. And then in addition to the meetings that we have where there are discussions, we almost always, with our quarterly meetings, have something else in addition to it. Matter of fact, every time we do. We had an ice cream social at our meeting just 2 weeks ago. We've done guided hikes, guided floats on the Clinch, local music, trips to parks, celebrations, and so forth. So probably none of this is a surprise to you, but this idea of actually varying the ways that you engage different people to make sure that different people get engaged for that. And then the sustained dialogue, the 5th of the 6 elements of this. And I don't actually have as much to share with this because it's mostly about a commitment, so that you're actually making sure that discussions fully explore the issues and interests, and only after significant effort has been made to find creative responses to differences. Not assuming that differences are insurmountable, not assuming that the first answer that you come up with, just because it's easy, is the right answer for things. And then helping participants distinguish in their conversations between the positions or demands people make and the actual needs and interests that underlie those positions, the sort of the why of things. And I just really have one example, and just to give from the Elizabeth River, the heavily industrialized 3 Superfund sites. As this plan was drawing to a close for the revitalization of Money Point, this heavily contaminated area, we did a final test for consensus for remediation plans for that element of the plan. And we actually do a 1, 2, 3 finger. So 1 meaning, no, you can't support it, and we need to find some other solution. 2 meaning you've still got some concerns, it's not necessarily ideal, but you're willing to live with it. And 3 meaning you're fully satisfied. And so after we've been meeting together for a year and 4 months, and this was really the sort of core element of this, and we found ourselves with mostly 3s, but several 2s also. And it would have been very easy for us to say, hey, we've invested 16 months in this, let's not reopen this. We've got consensus by definition, they're going to be willing to support it. But what might we lose by doing that? So with some trepidation, opened it up and said, let's not be satisfied with some 2s. Let's see if we can get everybody at 3s. So spent more time inviting people to share what their concerns were. And eventually understanding their concerns led to new proposals to develop additional measures. So just one example of several new oyster beds from that. So that we ended up actually with, I can't remember if we had all 3s, it was very close to all 3s, either all 3s or all very close to all 3s with full consensus for that particular recommendation. So the value of continuing to sustain that dialogue. And And then finally, this last one, evaluation and learning from this. And of course, that has to continue, that has to be done while you're in the middle of a process too. There's formative evaluation, and I'm not an evaluator, so this is language, that other people have come up with, not mine, but evaluation during the process to improve it. Summative evaluation upon completion of the process, and then the kind of summative, but also looking at the sort of outcome and impact in particular, that how are we achieving our ultimate goals for this. So, and it's a good practice to be doing all of these at different times, and for people to recognize that this is a learning process and you need to learn as you go along. So for the Elizabeth River, each meeting included a plus delta evaluation. So at the end of every meeting, we would say, all right, plus meaning what went well, and the delta meaning what do you want to change next time? And that's valuable. You're constantly learning about what people might want to see different from that. In the middle of the process, so about 8 or 9 months into the process, we did a written confidential evaluation. So asking people and giving people an opportunity to say things in confidence about the way things are going so that we could improve the process from that. And then following the process, a confidential evaluation conducted, and then the results, without naming names, shared with all participants. And that's pretty standard. And then you can actually go to a web page with periodic updates on the progress at Money Point. So elizabethriver.org Money Point Revitalization, they're still updating it, which is pretty exciting to be able to see. It's good to have some indication that the work has been done. And just, I'm not going to read these, but just to give you sort of a sample of what you're reporting back to them from that final evaluation and learning. And this was just one of the questions. Other comments or ideas, we had others about the value of the process, the value of the facilitation, the value of the technical consultants, ways you'd improve the process, and then the sort of other comments and ideas that people wanted to offer. Dan River, pretty much the same thing. Each meeting included a plus delta at the end of the meeting. What are we doing well? What do we need to change? The middle of the process, a written confidential evaluation offered. I think that was probably even more valuable for the dam because there was such intensive conflict at the start of the process because of the coal ash release. It was as you can imagine, many very angry, upset, and scared people wondering what was going to happen, what value of their farms, what value to the river, what value of their businesses was going to happen. So this was really important to be able to make that confidential. And then following the process, a confidential evaluation conducted, results shared with all participants also. And then in this case, a stakeholder implementation team, so deliberately formed to follow up with monitoring and implementation. So when we completed the work, the last meeting, I think our report was dated October 27th or something like that of last year. We had a follow-up meeting to say, now how are you going to hold yourselves accountable for taking these actions into account, so that they actually had the stakeholder implementation team to follow up with that as well. And just an example from this Likert scale with opportunity to comment, and I don't think I was able to find the evaluation for this one. I think I was able to find Elizabeth River, but not this one. I need to see if I can still find that. Just some of the questions we would ask people for that. And then the Clinch River, so Clinch River is ongoing, so we don't have the sort of final summative, but again, each meeting includes an evaluation. And then something a little bit different that many of you are familiar with, a logic model created to link long-term outcomes with inputs and actions. So partly because for the other rivers, we knew that there was a finite time period for this, whereas the Clinch River, it's an open time period. This actually, even though we didn't know when we started, it's a process that is still ongoing. So I will share that logic model in a little bit. The logic model basically is saying, what are our conditions? What sort of inputs do we have? What sort of actions does it lead to? And then how do we, what sort of long-term impacts are we trying to make, and how do we know that we're getting there? So each of the 5 action groups, so we've got these 5 action groups focused on the state park and access to the rivers and downtown revitalization and environmental education and water quality. They've all identified their own indicators of success, and then we update those periodically. And you can't really read that, but it's on the website, or it should be on the website. You should be able to find that, so that we're holding ourselves accountable. So if you look to the right-hand side, the impacts that we want to have: appreciation of interconnectedness, value for entrepreneurship, collaboration between towns, compatible recreation access, appreciation for the sensitivity of the Clinch ecosystem, and so forth. That working backwards, you've got the indicators, and we can identify what's going to be most important for that. So I've gone through these pretty quickly, even though it seems like a long time, and it makes it sound in retrospect like there's a formula for this, and I don't want to leave you with that impression at all. So this is one of my favorite photos. I actually took it on the way back from a meeting with the Elizabeth River project that we were doing, and it was raining. It was hard to see, and traffic was barely moving. I was stopped when I took this photo, and you see lane ends merge right and keep left. And just to recognize that as you're doing this work, it's okay. It's hard, but it's not to expect that everything's going to go smoothly. That idea of sustained dialogue means sustained effort. But it can be valuable. There's no guarantee that you're going to get the success you want. And I'm not going to go over all of these. I think I'm going to open it up for comments to go to my last slide. But I just want to show you, actually, there's some things that can only be done by bringing people together. It doesn't guarantee that bringing people together is going to achieve these outcomes. But the only way to do that, not on a one-time basis, not at a one-time public meeting, but over a period of time, for you to develop, for instance, promoting new understanding, the idea that you can actually validate local knowledge and create sort of joint fact-finding for research, and learn really substantially of others' needs and values and concerns, and learn to care about those needs, values, and concerns, improving the knowledge of substantive issues, and so forth. So I'm actually not going to go through all the other ones of that. To recognize they're on there if you want to take a look at that, and I've got a diagram that shows those. But I wanted to actually go to the last slide. So let me see if I can go to this last slide. Actually, let me go to the last one here. The building legitimacy for actions. Again, things that can only be done by deepening and widening participation so that people don't say, I've been excluded, it's not legitimate. By creating over a period of time the sense that there has to be truth-seeking, which may not be a norm when you start that process. By fostering transparency, and then these are all of these put together. I know you can't read that from that, but these are things, not that, again, that collaborative process, that substantial engagement is guaranteed to achieve these, but there's some of these things can only be achieved through substantial engagement, and some of the work we do has to have this. So just the last one that I have here, for those of you that have stuck with it, the Susquehanna River on the upper left-hand side. I took that photo near York in Lancaster. James River, I took that at, it was I think 5 degrees that morning. My phone stopped working shortly after I took that photo in the wintertime. The Clinch River I talked about in far southwest Virginia. This is a mine that I had, a Superfund site, Gilt Edge Mine in South Dakota. The Magothy River in Maryland. Eagle Harbor, Washington, a gorgeous view, and that whole harbor is a Superfund site. And then the Wasatch Range in Utah. And the interesting thing about that was the prohibition on dogs, or pets at all sorts, within the whole watershed for that. So Jasper, I feel like I've been talking a long, long time. I ended up not asking the other questions because I never was able to see the poll results, so I didn't really want to take our time doing that. But I think some of the questions we were interested in, what types of media do other people use? What sort of outreach do you do electronically with web or Facebook or other social media? What audiences you might have, and then my concern about the sort of the guidance, how useful guidance is for you. But I think we can open it up to, we're going to open it up to questions of all sorts from people, and I'm looking forward to being able to address those. So hopefully I've not been talking to myself the last hour. I have not heard from anybody else. Jasper, are you still here?
Yep, I'm still here.
Great.
Thanks for your presentation, Frank. I think if you want to open up a poll question while we do get to some questions, if anyone wants to send those in, You should be able to see them if you respond to the poll yourself. I think that's a weird...
so maybe that was it. I didn't respond to the poll myself.
Yeah, so I think that should... do you want me to open up what types of media do you use?
Sure. Yeah, and my apologies for folks then. So you actually wrote those in, and I was not able to see them. And if I'd answered it myself, I guess I would have been able to see them. But so if you want to open up any of those, that'd be fine. And in the meantime, I can take other questions that people might have. And I'm not sure how you're going to do this, whether you're going to be sharing them through the chat function or having people actually speak the questions.
So I haven't had any questions come in yet. If anyone does, you can use both the Q&A or the chat function, and I will pass those questions along. There is a poll open for anyone to fill out. We'll let it go for about another minute. So yeah, I'll give it a minute, and then hopefully you should see the results of the poll, and we can discuss any questions that do come in.
And while we're waiting, people can hear me, right?
Yep.
So Jasper, I don't know whether Nesha McCrae is actually on. I know she was hoping to get on from Virginia, and I actually worked with her on the Smith Creek TMDL implementation plan. And I'm going to tell a story on myself while people are doing that. So they actually had contracted with our institute because they felt like there was a need to do extra community engagement, additional community engagement, stakeholder engagement for this plan. And so we talked a lot about the first meeting, and so we get to the first meeting, and it was a rural area. You got a lot of farmers and others that are there. And the first, we start off with someone who's no longer part of the agency, but who really felt the need to make sure that people had some information about what the TMDL was and what the conditions at Smith Creek were and so forth. So it was a rather long presentation, and after 15 minutes, there were a group of 3 people that basically stood up and walked out very visibly. And our assumption was it was because we took too much time, and I think we did take too much time at the start. We should have begun with helping people get engaged in this and saying, we want to start off by, we've got to make some presentations about the TMDL and water quality, but we really should start off by asking you, what are your concerns and what are your questions that you have? As it turned out, those people were actually at the wrong meeting. They thought it was going to be a different meeting, so they didn't walk out because of the way that we behaved, not engaging them right away. But it still felt like that for us, and it was a lesson that I learned. I take away from that anyways. But Nesha also then and came up with, well, we came up with collectively, but I really give credit to Nesha and Tara Sieber from who was with DEQ, Virginia's DEQ at the time, to come up with a really, I think, brilliant way of getting community involvement in that. And so if Nesha is on, is it possible, Jasper, I don't know whether you can see whether she's on, whether you can have her speak to that?
I don't see her name on the attendee list.
Okay, okay.
But we do.
Well, while we're still waiting for the poll results, I will then tell you that basically we're concerned that even though we had a pretty decent turnout, like maybe there were 20 people there, that really wanted to do something more substantial and to get people to be able to talk effectively, and they needed to get a broader cross section. And so came up with this idea of a community forum that would actually be a combination. So there was a dinner held at a popular local, and I can't remember what it was, one of the local civic organizations that held it right in the middle of the watershed. Local food provided by people that are local. There were stations, so like 4-H Club and other sorts of stations where not just issues related specifically to the TMDL, but other issues involving the environment and agriculture in the area, that people were able to have stations that people could go to. And of course, as you got youth, which were some of them there, that it tends to attract their parents too, as does the food. And then inviting, rather than just agency, having other people making some presentations. So having presentations about different types of disease to avoid, and the impact of best management practices on preventing some of the disease for cattle, for instance, for that. So, and I think in contrast to some of our other strategies, so we went to a fair and had a little booth at a fair that they had, which we thought was a good idea, and we had about 2 people that actually talked to our booth. So that wasn't good. But the dinner meeting, we had dozens and dozens of people, several dozens of people that came and had that sort of successfully.
All right. Were you able to see the results of the poll? Maybe if you go into the polling tab on the sidebar, you might be able to get it.
All right, let me just look here. Is that the annotate poll or what? Oh, yeah, possibly. I see. Okay.
And the results should have popped up as they did last time.
I'm not seeing any results.
Okay. Well, on that note, the results were mainly email, web page, and newspapers were the big responses.
Okay. Okay. And could you also go? So could you say those again?
Email, newsprint, website, web pages, wikis, Facebook, public meetings, public notes.
Okay. Okay. Nothing too surprising there. I'm curious the success of new media that people have had, and I'm sure that there can be some elements that are mixed from that. My assumption would be that something like Facebook would be suitable if you're having a long-term process, something that would be multi-year process, whereas that would be less likely to be successful for something that would be more of a short-term process as well. And then
we do have a couple questions.
Do you have a question?
Yes, we have a couple of questions that came in.
Okay.
The first one is, where does the funding for events like the Ice Cream Socials come from?
Well, that's interesting. We actually got that donated. So we have a bunch of very creative people, and I've got some colleagues that work with that are not afraid to ask people for that. So we just had an ice cream social, as I mentioned 2 weeks ago. We had it at a new business in an area that has very few new businesses, Tazewell, Virginia, and coffee shop. And so partly we were featuring one of these new businesses, partly we were featuring what's it called, Honeybees, I think is the name of the caterer. And so she provided the ice cream, but then talked about her vision for the business with people that were there. So it was sort of a combination of, I mean, we didn't require her to provide the ice cream for her to be able to speak. But it was, we were asking for a panel of entrepreneurs to be able to talk about what sort of support do they need, how do they see themselves relating to the Clinch watershed, how they see themselves related to the work that we're doing. And she was able to get that donated. I will say that I think having interagency collaboration can be huge also. So we've found that that different agencies often have different limits and therefore different opportunities for budgets that they can have. So in Virginia, well, I'm not even going to go into all of them. There's lots of different agencies that have been able to provide different types of support. And the other element is because we are a nonprofit, we are an educational institution, we are able to get grants. And so for the Dan River, we did not need a grant because the Duke Energy was willing and eager really to pay for, we had meals with all of our meetings and refreshments with all of our meetings, and so we didn't need to do that. With both the Elizabeth River and with the Clinch River, we've had a combination of public and private monies, private meaning foundation monies, that we were able to get for that. And it's not easy to do. So hard work, finding resources, using the contacts and connections from a variety of different people, and persisting in that. And I'll say there have been a number of times when we just buy cookies on our own, cookies or snacks, or for the Elizabeth River, the very first meeting that we had that stakeholder group after this was after a couple of months of doing the stakeholder assessment, we went out and bought. The Money Point had this sort of story about Blackbeard's gold treasures being buried there, and the more likely story is that's actually where people came for payroll because of the industry that was there. But we bought treasure chests and assembled them the night before, little cardboard treasure chests, and then every meeting we would bring something, Tootsie Rolls or something else for them to put in there. It's corny, but it shows people that they're valued. It shows people that we're paying attention to them, and that this is more than just a formal exchanging of ideas, that that there are people here, that the impacts are on people, and we have to take into account those impacts. And I'm sure there are probably 1,000 other ideas people have for ways of doing that, but I guess we can't hear from others. So, more, Jasper?
All right, great. Yeah, one more question has come in. Collaboration can be very time-consuming. Sometimes we might not need to do all of this. Are there certain elements that are more important than others?
That's a great question, and that's always true. There's certain elements that are more important than others, right? So doing that initial assessment up front is a really valuable way of finding out about that, and understanding what your goals are. And so, the preliminary phase, like maybe developing the TMDL, might be something where you just don't have to do as much. Maybe it is more technology, or maybe because of controversy or conflict or lack of participation, that's one where you do have to invest more of the resources for that. I'm trying to think of any that I would say would be less important. I think sometimes for both the Dan River and for Elizabeth River, I was able to get substantial funding to do the initial assessment phase, and actually I was able to get $10,000 from the Virginia Department of Forestry through Urban and Community Forestry to do the initial assessment for the Clinch River too. So we were able to get some funding, but there are certainly circumstances where we can't do that, and where we have to rely on volunteers, or we have to rely on simply more informal communication, or perhaps even forego that sort of initial assessment, which can be costly, for that too. And I totally recognize the legitimacy of that collaboration can take more time than doing things, and recognize there are circumstances where they, where that certainly is the case. And I just have a funny story to tell in relation to that. I had a colleague who was approached, this was several years ago, about developing a collaborative process because there was trying to hide the location. There was a circumstance where a jurisdiction was going to be given substantial deed right away along a river. I mean, we're talking dozens and dozens of miles along a river, going through a number of different jurisdictions, and wanted to take advantage of that, and wanted to have my colleague facilitate a collaborative process that would help people define what sort of uses could they make of this, river trails and access points and so forth. And she said, sure, I'd be glad to do that. It sounds like a great project, and here's how much it would cost, and here's how long it would take. And they said, oh, no, we don't have time to do that. So, and she said something like 6 to 9 months, but they needed something right away. So a year later, she got another call, and it was the same question. So they had tried to do something, they ran into opposition, and she said the same thing, it's going to take 6 to 9 months. Maybe it's going to take a little longer, because people are apparently are sort of organized against this. And they said, sorry, we just don't have time to do that. So we don't know whatever happened to that, but not taking the time to do things can also be costly sometimes too. Again, but I don't want to suggest that a full-scale collaborative process needs to happen all the time. And if you have to reduce something, perhaps the initial assessment might be a way that you can help with that. But there are a lot of ways of saving time, getting people to volunteer, saving money and expenses, getting people to volunteer locations, getting people to do volunteer work, partnering with universities and colleges. Because I'm at one, I know that that's available, but you can often find classes that are willing and eager to do some of the work of engagement for you as well. I think I'll stop right there with that.
All right, and another, who are the stakeholders that are keeping these initiatives alive?
Great question. So in the case of the Elizabeth River, you've got a nonprofit that actually is very successful, Elizabeth River Project. It's very successful because it's made it a practice of doing everything collaboratively. It's about the most collaborative organization I've ever known. So, the river's got lots of problems. It had even more problems, 15 years ago. But as I said, the 3 Superfund sites, military installations, a number of brownfield sites, and so on. But the stakeholders actually keep coming back because Elizabeth River Project values them. It keeps inviting them. It keeps saying that we can't do this alone. So you have all sorts. You have agencies, all the agencies that have any sort of role in that. You have all the local governments, and this is four local jurisdictions that span that river. You've got many citizen groups and community members that are engaged with that, and then you've got the professional organizations ranging from large-scale Chesapeake Bay Foundation to some very small friends of the really tiny watershed. But the reason they participate is because they're invited, because they're told that they're valuable, and because they see that they're valuable. They see what they come up with is actually used to develop plans, and then they see success too, because there's evaluation and monitoring, and they can see that there are actually improvements for that. And then, for others, it depends on the circumstances. Oftentimes, it's a coalition of the willing, and oftentimes, it's, of course, the people that, because they have some sort of statutory responsibility, they need to be involved.
Okay. One more has come in. Have you ever faced opposition from local government or organizations, and how do you overcome that?
That's such a big question, and I don't know that I'm the best person for addressing that. I think there's a distinction between, let's say, opposition and concern. So typically local government, because the work that we're talking about is improving water quality, typically local governments at least share that goal, even if they may have really even polarizing concerns about the ways that that's happening, or the concerns that what this might do to their tax base or to their reputation or so forth. So it's a very good question. Excuse me, it's a very good question, and I think one of the key lessons is engaging them early and often, valuing, validating their perspective, making sure that they're not just informed, but invited to be at the table, and maybe even sometimes, of course, local government could be a leader of the table as well. I'm thinking of the Dan River because of the issues with the coal ash release. So while this community building process was going on, and it included people that have been nominated from the local jurisdictions, you also had the jurisdictions that were considering, taking legal action at the same time. And it was kind of a we recognize that this might be happening, and it might be the venue that people choose to pursue, and that could be very legitimate. But that's not going to stop the work of identifying what community members feel needs to happen to make them whole, and certainly the people from the jurisdictions, the cities and towns, were invited and did have representatives that participate in the process at the same time. That doesn't mean that they give up their right to do, to do other things. And, for instance, the Duke Energy was, I think the penalty was, initial penalty was something like $104 million. So this wasn't without costs and consequences that went beyond the collaborative process as well. But not saying, well, you either play with us or or you can't do anything else. You're at the table and you can't be anywhere else. That's just not the case. We're keeping doors open and keeping communication open. Jasper, I think I've worn everybody out.
Yeah, there haven't been any more questions coming in, but great job. Thank you for speaking on this topic, and very thorough, very in-depth, and very informative. I think we will end it here, and for everyone who's still on the line, please fill out the exit survey. You will be receiving an email in the coming days with follow-up information, as well as links to the presentation and the slides and the recording, as well as some follow-up information. So thanks again to Dr. Frank Dukes, and to everyone else, thank you for joining us, and keep an eye out for upcoming webinars in 2017.
Goodbye, everybody.